Akhenaton, Egypt's most controversial pharaoh. Over 3,000 years ago, this turbulent king began a revolution, overturning centuries of Egyptian belief. But his great experiment died with him, and in the resulting backlash, his successors tried to erase his name from history. So what drove Akhenaton to risk becoming the most reviled pharaoh in Egyptian history? Was his revolution driven by necessity, greed, or divine inspiration? To solve this mystery, Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat and archaeologist Miriam Cook journey to Akhenaton's abandoned city and discover an extraordinary project which is, for the first time, letting us look into the mind of Akhenaton, the rebel pharaoh. Akhenaton should have been just another in a long line of pharaohs. But instead, just 5 years into his reign, he suddenly and inexplicably decided to change everything. Banishing the old gods and closing their temples, he announced that one god now ruled Egypt. And as if to draw a line under the past, moved his capital and 50,000 of his subjects to a new city he ordered to be built hundreds of miles from their old homes. But why? What clues remain to one of the greatest Egyptian mysteries must still lie in the ruins of his lost city. So this is where the Egypt detectives decide to begin their search. At the time of Akhenaton's birth, around 1350 BC, Egypt had two ancient capitals: Thebes, the religious center in the south, and Memphis, the political hub some 400 miles to the north. But when Akhenaton came to build his new capital at a site now known as Amarna, he inexplicably placed it as far from these old seats of power as possible on this isolated desert site.
The story of Akhenaton's been told many times, but nobody's ever really explained why he decided to move the capital here to Amarna.
Yeah, and moving an entire capital city, now that would have been a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it would have meant displacing tens of thousands of people, making them leave their homes and what was familiar, and then getting them out here and making them work bloody hard to build a whole new capital city.
Today, only ghosts remain at Amarna. When the pharaoh died, his dream died with him, and just 25 years after it was begun, his city was left to be reclaimed by the desert. But in an empty tomb, high on the cliffside above the city, a clue to what drove Akhenaton can still be found carved on the walls.
Blimey. God, look at this.
This tomb was cut into the living rock at a time when Akhenaton's city still thrived, and his courtier, Ai, for whom it was built, carefully recorded his master's new beliefs on its walls. This is the face of Akhenaton.
Take a look on that wall there.
And above him shines the Aten, or sun disk. This, the pharaoh now proclaimed, was the one and only god. But for most Egyptians, this was unthinkable heresy. For millennia, they had worshipped many gods, usually represented in human or animal form. These gods, they believed, had made Egypt great. Now a new pharaoh had swept them and their priests aside, and had even declared that he was the new high priest, the single connection to the sun god they must all now worship. The courtier Ai, however, had no doubts, and the unique inscriptions on his tomb exalt the new god.
It's the hymn to the Aten, Akhenaton's own statement of religious belief. There's nothing else like it in the whole of Egyptian religious literature.
Can you read some of it?
Yeah, sure. Your radiance fills every land with your beauty. I am your son, born from your rays.
So a kind of manifesto?
Yeah, you could put it that way.
In this hymn to the Aten, Akhenaton set out his new ideology. He told his people that there was now just one all-powerful god, the Aten, to whom he alone could provide access. This was the one simple truth. But was this divine inspiration or Machiavellian cunning? Miriam and Dominic decide to head south to the city where Akhenaton grew up to see if the roots of his conversion can be uncovered there. The journey south from Amarna takes the Egypt detectives away from Akhenaton's radical new vision, back to the old religion of Egypt. At Thebes, the great temple of Karnak was the center of the royal cult of Amun and a focus of the old Egyptian religion whose history even then stretched back thousands of years. Here the temple walls show another, more surprising side to the young Akhenaton, far removed from the heretic of the history books.
Well, here's Akhenaton, or what's left of him.
But he looks just like a traditional pharaoh. Look, he's smiting the 9 enemies of Egypt. That's a very standard image.
Yeah, and another standard thing is the inscription at the top, which talks about him worshipping Amun.
So what happened?
Well, conventional images like this date from the beginning of Akhenaton's reign, but within the next couple of years, things begin to change completely.
Akhenaton had taken the throne not in that name, but as Amenhotep IV, a name which honored the god Amun worshipped at Karnak. But all was not well between the royal house of Amenhotep and the religious house of Amun. By the time of Akhenaton's accession, the large temples had become as rich and powerful as the pharaoh. Could Akhenaton's sudden conversion to Atenism have as much to do with the politics of this power struggle as with divine inspiration? Dominic has found an archaeologist who thinks it might.
There was a problem between the Amun priesthood and the kingship, with the priests jockeying for ultimate power. And by the time Akhenaton comes to the throne, this has been going on for several generations. And it was obviously something which Akhenaton had decided to grapple with and solve once and for all.
So Akhenaton's religious revelation actually had some very practical benefits for him. In his new religion, he was the only high priest, the only channel of communication with the one and only God. The priests of other gods were now irrelevant and powerless, and where better to assert his power than outside the wealthiest temple of them all, at Karnak.
If you go up there, you might get a better view of it. What can you see?
Well, it looks pretty much like a wasteland from up here, but I can see that there's plenty of buried archaeology here.
Well, that's the remains of the great temple Akhenaton built on this site, the Gempa Aten. It means I have found the Aten, and it's evidence of his religious ideas unfolding.
It was a highly provocative gesture, building the new Aten temple directly outside the ancient house of Amun, and was clearly designed to confront the old religion head-on.
And I can see that we're outside the boundaries of the temple precinct.
Yeah.
So why is he building out here?
Well, that's exactly the point. The temple originally faced that way, so its back was turned on the temple of Amun.
Hold on, I'm just going to come down.
Okay.
So Akhenaton began his campaign against the old faith here at its very heart in Thebes. Yet the temple of Amun still stands, while his temple is just rubble. So what went wrong? Why didn't he finish what he started in Thebes, but instead chose to leave the city forever and move to a lonely desert site hundreds of miles away? The answers may lie in an extraordinary project, which is painstakingly reassembling the evidence left by Akhenaton. Will these fragments help the Egypt detectives explain what turned a once dutiful king into a rebel pharaoh?
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The Egypt detectives are on a quest to investigate the mystery of ancient Egypt's most controversial pharaoh, Akhenaton. Over 3,000 years ago, this pharaoh suddenly turned his back on the traditional gods of Egypt and moved almost 50,000 of his people to a desolate spot in the middle of the desert. But what drove him there? Piety? Power? Or panic? The answer to this question is now coming to light in an archaeological project that is reconstructing the story in Akhenaton's own words, using records found hidden within the walls of the Karnak temple at Thebes. This gate was constructed over a decade after Akhenaton's death, but at its heart lies a clue to the fate of that pharaoh's dream. The core of this building is made up of unusually small blocks called talatat.
Goodness. Wow. This is amazing.
It is.
So this is the Akhenaton Temple project?
Yes, the results of that, yes.
But these talatat are not just ordinary stones. They had a life before they were used in the gateways of Karnak, as the decorated walls of the great Aten temple, demolished soon after Akhenaton's death. On their side lie clues to the real story of the rebel pharaoh. Professor Don Redford has the job of analyzing this elaborate jigsaw, and Miriam has joined him at the warehouse where the blocks are stored.
What are talatat?
That's the term we apply to a standard-sized block 52 centimeters long by 26 wide. About 100 pounds, which a single person could carry, a man, a worker.
How do they compare to a normal building block?
Well, the standard-sized block in Egyptian masonry is much larger, something about in the order of this, weighing 2 to 2.5 tons usually, so considerably heavier and more difficult to move than a talatat.
Don Redford believes that the size of these blocks is significant. Akhenaton was in a hurry to build his temple, and these smaller blocks meant his builders could work fast.
Certainly they speeded up the work, and Akhenaton seems to have wanted that. The workers were being forced to work so quickly that design and layout sometimes was faulty, and it seems rather sloppy work.
Do you get the sense of an impulsive character behind this building technique?
I do think there was an impulsiveness in his personality. He was bound to worship the sun god, to promote that single god, and he was going to do so by eliminating all other allusions to mythology in Egypt, which of course would entail referring to other deities. This was anathema to him. He was going to forbid it, and he was moving in stages towards a very purified, almost puritanical type of religion devoted to a single god.
Akhenaton was clearly in a hurry to push through his revolution. Rushing to replace the old gods, rushing to begin his new order. But was this through religious fervor or fear? This is Pylon 10, a huge gate that once guarded the Karnak temple. Its core is still piled high with talatat, and at the very top, one sandstone block holds another enigmatic clue. A message from Akhenaton to his people, a message they may not have wanted to hear.
Well, here it is. At last, the inscription.
Can you translate it?
Yes, I think I can.
This is the most important column, which reads, "They have stopped, one after the other, whether of precious gems or gold or silver, I presume. He's speaking of the cult images of the gods.
That phrase, the gods have stopped, that's a rather strange statement. And what exactly is he saying there then? The gods have stopped. What does that mean?
That's very odd, actually. It's very strange. The verb he uses to cease movement or to stop is what elsewhere in Egyptian texts is used of what the sun never does. The sun keeps going around and around without ceasing. But here he's saying that other manifestations of the supernatural have ceased. So this is obviously, it seems to me, one of these speeches that were made periodically by the kings of Egypt to their court and for public dissemination on walls and this sort of thing. And he is making here an announcement.
So what impact would this have had?
It must have been a bombshell.
Akhenaton was attempting to end the centuries-old way of life at a single stroke. In one simple pronouncement, he had declared that the old gods of Egypt were dead and only his god, the sun disk, lived on, ceaselessly circling the heavens. But Don Redford believes that this message was not what the people of Thebes wanted to hear, and that their hostile response may have driven Akhenaton to found his new desert city. To show Miriam evidence of this opposition, Don takes her to the west side of the Nile, where the Egyptians traditionally buried their dead.
Well, here we are, tomb number 188, the tomb of Nefer of the Theban necropolis, and they're already at work. Shall we give them a hand, clearing the stones?
Why not?
Right.
This tomb belonged to one of Akhenaton's loyal servants, and its walls still bear witness to the fervent opposition which his revolution had unleashed.
Wow, it's really damaged, isn't it?
Oh, yes. About 80 years ago, a family lived here, and their cooking fires covered the ceiling with soot.
Nefer's tomb was cut over 3,000 years ago, and on its walls are recorded the extraordinary changes that he witnessed in his lifetime, from Akhenaton's childhood to the cultural revolution of his reign.
And here is the man himself, Nefer, standing before his king, facing his king, and gesticulating with his hand to his mouth, which is a sign of deference before the monarch. You don't want to speak or breathe directly on him. Here is what I'm talking about.
So these are clearly traditional gods, but I can see the ardent disk right here.
That's right. This represents a major change. And here you see, violently hammered away, the rock where the figure of Akhenaton was originally placed.
To Egyptians, destroying a king's image destroyed his place in the afterlife, a demonstration of almost fanatical hatred for the man they had once called Pharaoh. But why?
And in the 4 columns down here, there were invocations to other gods. Well, I think there is something of an answer in this very tomb, and I'll show you. As for the servant who is not diligent concerning the divine offerings of the sun disk, he gives himself into your power.
So this is giving us an idea of the political situation in Thebes at the time.
There is a veiled threat. The servant who is not diligent, who is lax about the new program that the king is instituting, is going to give himself into the power of God, and that's for ill. Well, I can show you that if we go down the wall over here.
Akhenaton intended to convert his people by threats, not faith.
Here is Nefer, seated on a chair with his servants and secretaries in front
But
of him.
this revolution affected more than just his people's beliefs. It was destroying their livelihoods.
But the measuring for the sun disk is in superabundance. In fact, the incomes, the endowments are being diverted from all the other gods' temples into the new temple of the sun disk. What he was doing was really throwing people out of work in all the other temples, and it was building up a considerable amount of resentment against him.
Ordinary people faced financial disaster as their employers, the temples, were closed down. Akhenaton now had the temple's money, but that was also his people's income.
The Egyptian temples were the powerhouses of the Egyptian economy. So if someone like Akhenaton comes along and closes down all the temples and takes over their assets, then this is making quite a considerable economic statement, and it is economic suicide.
In breaking the power of the temples, the pharaoh was bankrupting his people, and it seems neither the priests nor the thousands of people they employed were prepared to accept this lying down. For all his power, Akhenaton couldn't change Thebes fast enough. So he simply left the problem behind. He abandoned the old city with all its reminders of the old religion, abandoned his own temple outside Karnak, and headed off to the desert site of Amarna, where a vision told him to found a new capital. He was running from his critics.
He was receiving criticism. It was not veiled criticism. These were evil words, as he characterizes them. He simply cut and ran and created this new sort of dream city of his in the waste of the desert, where he could be his own man, put down his own roots, and he didn't have to deal with anyone.
At Amarna, there is evidence to support this idea. Akhenaton's own words, inscribed on tablets erected on the city boundaries, read like the words of a frightened man.
It was worse than those things heard by any kings who had ever assumed the white crown.
So Akhenaton hadn't moved his capital to Amarna purely from choice. He had begun his revolution at Thebes, but in Thebes it had started to go wrong. Now he was afraid, and probably with good reason.
I think one can interpret this as indicating that there was some opposition to Akhenaton's plans, which could even have manifested themselves in an assassination attempt at the king.
An assassination attempt would have been the ultimate challenge to Akhenaton's power base, leaving him no option but to leave Thebes and head into the desert to create his new city. This is a new and startling portrait of a unique pharaoh, a man whose impetuous desire to establish ultimate power nearly wrecked his country's economy and left him haunted and hunted. King of a dreamlike desert city that would prove little more than a mirage. Miriam is convinced by this practical explanation, but Dominic still sees in Akhenaton's work the hand of a man divinely inspired.
Well, I prefer the idea of Akhenaton as a practical politician. He's a man driven by circumstances rather than being a grand thinker. It's tactics. He's not strong enough to implement the changes he wants to here at Thebes, so he moves to Amarna.
I think we've just got completely opposing views. That's not the Akhenaton I know.
But will we ever know the real Akhenaton, Dominic?
To look into the mind of Akhenaton is still to look into an enigma. Shortly after his death, his own heirs began a full and terrible backlash against his revolution. His temples were destroyed, his image removed from every building, document, and painting that could be found. He became to the Egyptians a non-person, a man and a time they pretended had simply never happened. Only now is his story re-emerging from the sands of Amarna, a lost pharaoh for a lost city, a man whose vision, inspired by avarice, power, and panic, went too far and too fast for his people to follow. Giza, last resting place of three of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history. A wonder of the world. And home to a mystery. In a temple connected to the pyramid of the pharaoh Khephren, archaeologists discovered a huge and perfectly preserved statue of the king, carved in an exotic iridescent stone. But this sculpture is in no local rock. In fact, this striking material can only be found deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from Giza. So how did Khephren's people manage to bring this marvel here, 4,000 years ago? To investigate this puzzle, Egypt detectives, archaeologist Miriam Cook and Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat search out the lost quarries of Khephren and undertake a unique experiment in ancient Egyptian engineering. the statue stares out at us across 4 millennia, a silent monument to the achievements of a lost civilization. It still inspires awe in those who come under its gaze, none more so than Egyptian antiquities chief Zahi Hawass.
Is one of the most beautiful statues ever made by a sculptor. It's really unique. I always say that he looks like a king because the sculptor put the royal blood in the statue that you can feel that he's a king. When I look at the profile of that statue, I can really feel that the hawk is taking the king and flying with him up to the sky.
Made for a living god, the presence of this statue at Giza is also something of a miracle. It was carved from a single 3-ton block of gneiss, a rare stone not found anywhere close to the pyramid site. The question for the detectives is, where did this huge stone originally come from? And how did the Egyptians, with no modern technology, manage to get it here? The logical place to begin seems to be the valley temple where the statue was found. This is in itself an incredible feat of engineering. It is constructed of massive blocks of red granite, which, like the statue, also must have been carried great distances, as this rock isn't found locally. Perhaps finding the source of this could provide the first clue to the statue's origin. The detectives decide to split up. Dominic's expertise is best put to use researching ancient Egyptian technology. Miriam, meanwhile, heads south, down the Nile, to meet the archaeological team who are working on the puzzle of Khephrun's quarries. Aswan, the southern edge of ancient Egypt. This has been identified as where Khephrun found the massive red granite blocks to build his valley temple. Although Aswan is hundreds of miles from Giza, quarrying here was possible thanks to the Nile. When the blocks of stone had been cut from the cliffs and roughly shaped on site, they only had to be moved a short distance to the river, where they could be loaded onto barges, letting the water do the work of carrying them north to the pharaoh's court. Without the river, these quarries would never have existed, as the job of moving the cut stones more than a few hundred meters would have been impossible. But Aswan is not home to the rare gneiss of the statue. In fact, this rock doesn't occur anywhere on the banks of the Nile. In 1999, an international team of scientists came together to see if they could solve the riddle of the location of Khephrun's missing quarry and discover how the pharaoh's builders actually brought the stone to Giza.
Many tools actually were found at our excavation.
Are these fairly typical, are they?
Yeah, yes, this is coming from Khephrun quarry, which famous kind of this tool.
For Miriam, finding the statue stone means a journey deep into Egypt's hostile western desert, to the place where team leader Ian Shaw believes they have rediscovered the lost quarry of Khephrun. In the 1930s, a British Army patrol had taken a road into the western desert and got lost in a sandstorm. In their confusion, the patrol stumbled upon a mysterious place called Gebel El Aser. Scattered everywhere across the desert, they saw blocks of stone and countless stone tools. Nearly 4,500 years after Khephrun's stonemasons had left there for the last time, the patrol had accidentally found his quarry. This was the source of his prized stone. Ian and the team have come to this desolate site many times, and by carefully removing centuries of sand, they have begun to uncover its secrets.
Well, here we are. This is what you've been looking for, the Khephrun quarries.
It's an incredible place. And I recognise the stone. It's very distinctive, isn't it?
This is one of the spoil heaps that forms part of the whole quarry setup. And here I am standing on
the spoil heap, which is a mixture of material which has been taken out from over here, and you can see lots of the blocks that they've begun to work that have come out of the ground over there. And down here, lots of lovely big fragments of precisely the kind of stone that the Khephren statue is made from.
But how could these discarded tools and fragments of stone in the desert be definitely linked to Khephren?
Well, this is impressive. It looks like these blocks have been specifically placed here.
What you have to imagine is that originally here between these two big slabs of the Khephren stone, there was a slab with the name of a ruler who sent an expedition here, and that ruler was Khufu.
This is the vital link. Khufu was Khephen's father, proving that the quarry was known and used during that dynasty. Perhaps it was even memories of the wonderful stone brought back by Khufu's expedition that inspired his son to commission his own extraordinary statue. But the Egypt detectives still have questions. Egyptians moved heavy stones by water, but this quarry is 35 miles from the nearest point on the Nile where it could be transferred to a barge for the journey to Giza. So how had they moved it? Miriam calls Dominic to see if his knowledge of Egyptian wall paintings might throw any light on how these engineering problems were solved.
I can think of one particular tomb that might be really helpful, but the thing is that the picture may be really damaged. I've heard that it's not in very good shape, so I don't know how far it'll get us.
Well, I think you should really go and have a look at it.
The problem is that it's up a really steep slope, so I'm not promising anything.
The tomb is at Deir el-Bersha, a necropolis over 100 miles south of Cairo. But Dominic isn't convinced he can even get there. A recent operation on his ankle makes him extremely anxious about his chances of success.
There are two things that I'm worried about. One is that the relief may no longer exist, and the second is that it's up a very, very steep mountainside, which I don't think I'm going to be able to get up.
It was going to be a tough climb, and there was no guarantee that there would be anything to see at the end of it.
Here it is. Things I do for Egyptology.
The tomb was made for an Egyptian governor who immortalized his glorious life on its walls. Old records show that the painting depicted how a huge statue had been moved. Dominic just has to hope that this ancient picture still survives.
It's quite hard to see in here in this dark tomb after the bright light out of the desert, but
At first, it looks as if Dominic is out of luck.
these Coptic crosses don't look like very good news because it might mean that the painting's been vandalized. There's been a rockfall from the ceiling as well, which has left this great huge blank. And here it is. Here it is, after all that. It's badly broken up by the rockfall, but you can see a massive statue being drawn along on a sledge. And it's being lubricated as it moves along by water being poured on it. And it's being pulled by these massed ranks of men, 3 deep, who are pulling on the ropes that are attached to the sled to move it along.
The wall painting suggests that there is no real mystery to moving huge stones. Egyptians simply put them on a sledge and used the brute force of a huge number of laborers to drag them along. It's time to call Miriam.
Hello?
Hey Miriam, it's Dominic.
Oh, Dominic, did you get into the tomb?
Yes, I did, and the relief is in really good shape.
What does it show about the movement of the blocks?
Well, they're put on sledges, wooden sledges, which are drawn along by teams of men on ropes. And to ease the movement of the sledges, water is poured as a lubricant.
So do you think this is the answer? This is how they were getting the blocks out of the quarry?
Yep, I think that's the answer to how they move the blocks.
So is this the end of the trail for the Egypt detectives? Did Khephren get his stone by simply sending hundreds of men into the desert to drag it back for him?
They look as if they've just been freshly cut these stones down here, don't they?
Back at the quarry, however, The discovery of mysterious stone structures in the sand suggests the Egyptians had in fact been far more ingenious than anyone had imagined. Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook are investigating the mystery of this statue of the pharaoh Khafre. It was carved from a block of very rare stone that came from a distant desert quarry. Usually the ancient Egyptians relied on barges on the Nile to transport such heavy blocks. But this quarry was deep in the western desert. So how did they move a 3-ton rock across 35 miles of scorching sand to reach the Nile? Dominic has found a tomb painting showing a huge statue being dragged by hundreds of men, suggesting brute force was the answer. If so, there should still be evidence at the quarry of this massive desert army. Miriam asks Ian Shaw if his team know how many people worked here 4,500 years ago.
I'm thinking about how these blocks were moved. And the image that comes to my mind is large numbers of men dragging these sledges with big blocks on top of them. How feasible is that here? Would it have worked?
It's not possible. There weren't large numbers of people at this site.
Ian's evidence comes from his work here amongst the low stone walls of what was once a workers' camp.
Well, we've got the remains here of some kind of oval encampment. So you can see the wall coming around here, and then the side of the slope. And the kind of numbers that you're talking about that would be needed to haul one of these great huge sledges along, they're just too many people to have housed in something like this. There just wasn't any kind of large settlement that you'd expect to be housing the kind of workforce that you'd need to pull one of these big sledges.
So something other than sheer force must have been used to move Khafre's stone. There were simply never enough people at the quarry here to do it in the way shown in the painting. The investigation seems to be going nowhere, stuck in the engulfing, smothering desert sand, a problem from which Khafre's enigmatic statue had somehow escaped. The team know the answer must lie in the quarry itself, if they can just put together all the clues. An obvious start would have been to make the blocks as light as possible, and the team's geologist, Tom Heldal, has shown that this is what happened. Instead of moving massive raw blocks, the Egyptians cut them down to a convenient statue size in situ. Sculptors called these blanks.
They were using hammer stones, like this one here. That's made of a slightly harder stone that they can use for carving the surface or hammering the surface to a smooth, to one plane. And this one is a whole one, but you're also, like this one you can see have been used. It's broken in two and left in the quarry. So in this case you can see this is a asymmetrical block that is quite flat on the bottom. And it's a thin edge, narrow edge here, and it's a bit fatter here. And that is actually fitting the shape of a sitting pharaoh sculpture.
So this was the sort of size block Khafre had moved, but it was still far too large to simply drag. At Aswan, the answer had been water transport. So could that be the answer here? Was there once water in the desert? The archaeologist went back to the data for long-term climate change and made a remarkable discovery. Around 4,500 years ago, when the quarry was in use, North Africa was probably greener and seasonally wetter.
The evidence that we have here...
And sure enough, team member Elizabeth Bloxham has found evidence that suggests there was once at least some water at the quarry.
Been focusing on this side of the research.
So Elizabeth, why do you think this is a well? Because it looks very similar to a small hut.
So if you look at the ground surface, you can see it's this very dark brown mud with very, very deep cracks here, indicating that it's a well and the water was coming up into these cracks.
And is it the same period as the Khafre quarries?
Yes, it is, because there are similar wells in the quarries, and one of them had an Old Kingdom pouring vessel in the base in a similar crack like this.
How does this particular well inform us about climate change, that it was a wetter environment here?
Simply because the water was so close to the surface, about 3 feet, so it indicates seasonally higher rainfall at the time.
Many other wells have now also come to light at the quarry, suggesting that water was available here 4,500 years ago. But you can't float a barge on underground water.
So we have water here, but we're still 35 miles from the Nile. Is there any river or channel that could have connected the two that might provide some kind of water transport?
Well, we do have the Wadi Tushka, which is just a short distance over there.
Today the Wadi Tushka is a dry valley, but 4,500 years ago, in the rainy season, it could have filled up with water and provided Egyptian engineers with a connection to the Nile. But there is still a problem. The wadi is some distance from the quarry itself, so the ancient Egyptians had to first get the stone overland to the wadi and then somehow get the blocks onto the water. So could the answer lie in these puzzling structures back at the quarry itself?
Can you feel it?
These wedge-shaped ramps were built from the same stone used in the pharaoh's statue, but with mysterious tracks at their base. The team are convinced these must hold the final clue.
Well, we've established that the environment was a lot wetter at that time and that water possibly played an important part in the transport of these blocks. But what is this, and how would this have fitted into the equation?
Well, basically, we know that this is a type of stone ramp of the time of Khephren, and like most ramps, the basic idea seems to have been taking the big stone blocks that would eventually be statues up to the top here, and our initial assumption was that what they were trying to do was to get them onto some kind of conventional wooden sledge.
But then we excavated further and we realised how high the ramp is. A conventional low-lying sledge would only come up to this height. But we also have these very deep and wide tracks. So it seems that this was purpose-built for a vehicle that we don't know about in the archaeological record so far.
But purpose-built for what kind of vehicle, do you think?
Well, we know that the task that the Egyptians had was to get the stone from here to the Nile, to the river, and we know that the Khephren statue was found at Giza, and that therefore that was the ultimate destination of the statue blocks, 800 miles up to the north by river.
But they would also want to minimise the amount of times that they moved the block.
So what you're suggesting is a kind of amphibious vehicle?
That's certainly one possibility.
Moving the pharaoh's stone by sledge would have been an almost impossible task. So the archaeologists believe that the ancient Egyptians may have come up with an ingenious engineering solution, an amphibious vehicle. This would only need to be loaded once and could then move the stone across both land and water. This sketch gives us an idea of how this remarkable vehicle might have looked. A simple, sturdy raft made buoyant with inflated animal skins. Underneath the raft were runners that allowed it to be precisely placed in front of the ramp. That's the reason for those mysterious tracks. Then it could be dragged, probably by animals, to the flooded Wadi Tushka, and from there floated down to the Nile. This theory is partly supported by this rare wall engraving that Elizabeth found. It depicts an ancient raft provided with additional buoyancy by animal skins filled with air, which could then bear the weight of these huge stone blocks. But were the archaeologists correct? The Egypt detectives returned to Aswan to put the theory to the test. Could such a craft have solved Khepren's transportation problem? In Aswan, they have commissioned a small-scale version of the craft from team member Adil Kalani. He and his colleagues use only the materials available to the ancient Egyptians, wooden planks, rope, and inflatable goat skins, to create one of these amazing amphibious barges.
The skins around.
To test the theory properly, the model has to be precisely scaled and balanced.
What's the scale of this compared with the loading ramp and the tracks?
About a quarter of the size of the one that would have been used in conjunction with the loading ramps.
So these two pieces of wood here, are these the runners that would have gone into those ruts in front of the ramp?
Yes, exactly. They would fit into those tracks. Quite easy to hold it across.
As final preparations are made, it begins to look doubtful whether this apparently fragile craft will bear the weight of the stones they have prepared, exactly 1/4 of the original full-sized load. There's only one way to find out. As the sun sets over the Nile, the craft is loaded, then prepared for launch. It's the first time the idea has been used in 4,500 years. Will it float? The answer is a surprising but triumphant yes. This may only have been a miniature version of a much grander original, but it proves that the principle works. Such a craft could have carried the rare stone from the quarry to the Wadi Tushka and then to the Nile for its final journey to Giza. Only then, after a 700-mile journey across sand and water, could that precious iridescent rock be transformed into the image of Khephren himself, granting immortality in stone to a man the Egyptians believed had been a god on earth. The civilization of ancient Egypt left behind a spectacular legacy, but also many unsolved puzzles. None of these is more controversial than explaining when and how it all began.
Ancient Egypt has inspired awe for thousands of years, and its monuments, like the Great Pyramid, are among the wonders of the world.
From the building of the Great Pyramids to the death of the last pharaoh, Cleopatra, whole libraries have been written about ancient Egypt. But one chapter remains nearly blank. It's first. Just where did this dazzling society spring from? For Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook, this is the greatest mystery of all. Can clues from 6,000 years of history be pieced back together? And if so, where will they lead? Can the trail still be followed back to find the founders of Egypt? The problem of finding the first Egyptians began in the 19th century. To the Western archaeologists of the age, it seemed that the builders of this great civilization couldn't have been ancestors of the poor inhabitants of the country they saw around them. They must have come from outside. And so they hypothesized that the first Egyptians came from beyond the Nile Valley, from a more sophisticated civilization. And so the question was largely left for over 100 years. Beguiled by the golden heights of Egyptian civilization, few have bothered to investigate this vital but less glamorous period. As a result, the origin of ancient Egypt remains a mystery, with many books claiming simply that the first Egyptians must have come from another, more sophisticated land. It's a theory which infuriates the man in charge of Egypt's ancient sites, archaeologist Dr. Zahi Hawass.
It's insulting to the mind of the people who talks about this, because it means that no human being can build a pyramid, and that's why it makes them to be small and makes them to be not really smart, because they never look at the Egyptian civilization. They never really study that.
Zahi Hawass is convinced that the roots of ancient Egypt lie in Egypt itself and were not imported from the outside. So to test this theory, the Egypt detectives have decided to trace back some of the most powerful symbols of ancient Egypt to their roots to see where that takes them. For Dominic, the key to this lies in tracing the origins of the three key icons associated with every Egyptian's greatest obsession, their religion.
They made masks to preserve their appearance. They used mummification to keep their bodies intact. And they constructed symbolic boats in which they would travel eternally through the heavens like the gods.
If these three ingredients, death masks, mummies, and symbolic boats, were essential to Egyptian society at its height, then tracing them back to their origins should lead back to the time and place where it all began. But where to begin looking?
How are we going to solve this puzzle of the first Egyptians?
Well, we have to look at archaeological evidence. There's some very early sites in the Nile Valley, and these must give us some important clues.
I'd like to do something different. There are some very early texts in one of the first pyramids. They might prove just as revealing as the archaeology.
While Miriam scans the literature for the earliest archaeological sites in the Nile Valley, Dominic's knowledge of Egyptian texts leads him straight to Saqqara, burial ground of some of the earliest pharaohs. Here, in one of the first pyramids ever built, are carved a unique set of inscriptions which just might hold a clue to the origins of their writers and the civilization that was only then beginning to flourish. Inside this tomb, Dominic thinks he might have found their first clue, written in a text unseen by the public for 10 years.
Mind your head.
Hey. Wow. This is absolutely incredible.
Isn't it stunning?
It looks almost pristine.
Yeah, it's been closed to the public for 10 years to preserve it properly.
Inscribed on the walls of the burial chamber are the pyramid texts, a collection of sacred spells that protected the dead pharaoh on his dangerous journey into the afterlife. But despite this being one of the first pyramids ever constructed, the spells are already highly sophisticated, suggesting that their history stretches much further back. And one particular element here has caught Dominic's attention, one of his key icons.
One thing you see again and again are these solar boats, like here, in which the dead king travels in order to be reborn. And during that journey, he's very vulnerable to attack from hostile animals like scorpions and snakes, even malicious donkeys.
The sunboat was an essential element in Egyptian culture, so finding it here at the beginnings of their civilization shows the idea could not have been imported from abroad at a later date, and may, like the texts themselves, be older still. And there's also a clue in the texts here suggesting where the detectives should investigate next.
Two places that come up again and again are these twin cities, Nekhen and Nekeb. The Egyptians seem to have regarded them as incredibly ancient places, almost like the centers of their own origin.
And do we know where these places were or where they are? Because it sounds like a really good lead.
Yeah, well, Nekeb is the modern El Kab.
Miriam's research confirms that El Kab is an important archaeological site. So although it lies some 460 miles south of Cairo in Egypt's arid eastern desert, a journey there had to be the next stage in the quest for the first Egyptians. To get to this remote site, Miriam hitches a ride with archaeologist Dirk Hager, who has spent his career far from the famous temples and tombs of the Nile Valley, studying faded images scratched on sandstone cliffs in the hostile wilderness of the desert. Images from the dawn of Egyptian civilization. After years working in the desert, Dirk has only recently published his research.
Is this the most impressive rock art gallery at El Kab?
Yes, it is by far.
One of the many sites at El Kab, this outcrop is called the Rock of the Vultures. It's an ancient art gallery, and its surfaces are alive with pictures.
Well, it's beautiful.
Dirk is convinced that these provide powerful clues about the origins of ancient Egypt, and some of the images prove to be very familiar indeed.
Look, Miriam, this is one of the most important compositions in the rock art of El Kab. So what you have here is a square-shaped boat associated with a lot of animals, and these are mainly donkeys. You see there's another huge boat here, and there are two representations here of donkeys, and as you can see they are shown with a stroke, sort of a spear in their back. Now, why is this? Donkeys were considered malicious beings, and they definitely had a function in rock art, but one way or another they had to be rendered armless, so they represented them with a spear in their back.
It is a remarkable discovery. Both the boats and donkeys are exactly the same symbols Dominic had found in the pyramid at Saqqara, a link between the first pharaohs and the mysterious rock carvers of El Kab. But there is a problem. Whilst these images are undoubtedly ancient, how can Dirk Hager tell exactly when they were made?
Can you see it?
Oh, I can see the boat.
The sunboats and donkeys could have been scratched here at almost any time, but Dirk has found a way to date these pictures, and the clue lies in pots like these.
This type of boat with these two cabins, these sickle-shaped boats, are typical for the period between about 3,500 and 3,200 BC, because they are also a very typical, very common motif on the pottery from that period.
These pots, whose age we know thanks to radiocarbon dating, use similar images of sunboats in the same style, so they must be from the same time. And that is nearly 1,000 years before even the earliest pyramid was built, taking our detectives deep into Egyptian prehistory. And these aren't the only carvings from El Kab. Dirk has discovered that scratched beneath the boats are still older and stranger images. Giraffes. These exotic animals, with their long necks reaching towards the sun, are evidence of an even earlier form of sun worship.
The giraffes are clearly older than that, and my hunch is that they date from between 4,000 and 3,500 BC.
Why were boats replacing giraffes?
Climate became completely unfavorable for these large animals, giraffe, elephants, etc. So they became increasingly scarce in the landscape, and people had no longer confidence in them. So they needed a new symbol, a new device to act as a hero of the sun. And they chose the boat, because the boat was enormously important in their lives. The power of one image, of the older image, was transferred upon the newer image.
5,500 years ago, as Egypt dried out and the deserts began to form, the giraffes that had been worshipped here started to disappear. To replace them, the people needed a new symbol, and what better than the boats which plied the river that was now their lifeline. This then was the origin of the solar boat image, not imported, but created in the Nile Valley. Over thousands of years, the image of the solar boat would slowly become central to Egyptian beliefs, not just as a symbol, but actually being turned into reality. Here, next to the Great Pyramid, archaeologists have unearthed the remains of this, a sunboat, a tangible relic measuring 142 feet long and designed to take the dead pharaoh's soul into the afterlife. Sunboats like this were buried next to many Egyptian pyramids, physical manifestations of the carvings at El Kab, created around 1,000 years earlier.
Examples.
But El Kab alone cannot solve the riddle of the origins of the Egyptians. Whilst the carvings survive, there is no other sign here of the people who created them. No settlements, no artifacts, nothing to tell us who they were or where they originally came from. If these people were the first Egyptians, the evidence for their lives must lie elsewhere, perhaps nearby. The question is, can the Egypt detectives sweep away 6,000 years of desert sand to come face to face with the first Egyptians? Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook are in search of the origins of ancient Egypt. Miriam has already traced one of the most important symbols in ancient Egypt, the sunboat, back to a prehistoric rock art site used at least 1,000 years before the pyramids. But the creators of this place are a mystery. If they are the ancestors of the ancient Egyptians, then where were they living? To answer this new puzzle, the detectives set about finding out more about the ancient people of the Nile Valley.
How are you doing?
Not too bad.
How'd you get on as El Kab?
It was fantastic. Dirk showed me some incredible rock art. It's the very same images that we saw in the pyramid text. There's boats with solar significance, there's those malicious donkeys that we saw before. It's the same ideas, but it's just a very early stage.
So how far back are we talking?
Oh, it's about 6,000 years ago.
Blimey. That's really pushing back the frontiers of settlement in the valley, isn't it?
Yeah, but the problem is that we don't have the archaeology to go with it. So we know very little about the people that created it. I was thinking about that other place that's mentioned in the pyramid text, the twin town of El Kab.
That's an amazing site.
Two ancient towns had been mentioned in the pyramid text. Nekeb had been identified as El Kab, whilst across the river, Nekhen is now known to be the ancient city of Hierakonpolis. This has later become an important center where pharaohs worshipped the falcon-headed Horus. Sites recently excavated here have been dated to the same time as Miriam's rock art, so perhaps this is where the Egypt detectives can find the missing craftsman of El Kab. In charge of the site is René Friedman.
So this may be an Egyptian. The person certainly may have been a poorer person, so...
Poor person.
So you can...
René is another of the handful of archaeologists who are searching for the founders of ancient Egypt.
Because we can see...
If this was where the people who carved the rocks at El Kab lived and died, then this should be the place to hunt for other clues that will tell us if these really were the first Egyptians. The symbolic boats from the pyramid texts had led Miriam back to these people. But what about Dominic's other key Egyptian symbols, the death masks and the mummies? If their origins could also be traced back to here, then this really would be the home of the first Egyptians, and the trail seems to be hotting up.
This is made out of fired clay, and, you know, it fits, it works. It was tied behind the ears. There's little holes, and there's even a little divot for the chin, so it would fit very comfortably on the face.
So is this the ancestor of the mask of Tutankhamun?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've always wondered where funerary masks get their start, and now we have the answer.
Do you think it had the same kind of symbolism as the later masks?
I would think so. I think this was sort of a shortcut to the afterlife, to already becoming a spirit. As we know from later times, masks had an incredible amount of power simply by being masks. You know, putting them on made you the divinity.
So the death masks can also be traced back to here. But the Egypt detectives still need to find their last clue, that other great symbol of Egyptian culture, mummies. Could they also have had their start here?
We have some of the earliest evidence, if not the earliest evidence, for the beginnings of artificial mummification. Here we have a mummified hand, and this dates to about 3600 BC, and you can see the fingers still in there. And the other hand would be placed over it because the people were buried on their sides in a fetal position, preparing for rebirth, with the hands by the head. And these were wrapped in layers and layers of resinated linen, like a papier-mâché. They'd coat it in linen, and then they'd apply a layer and mold it also around the face, the base of the head, and the hands.
So all three of Dominic's key symbols, the solar boats, the funerary masks, and mummification, can be traced back to El Kab and Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekhen and Nekeb. These finds date from at least 5,500 years ago, well before the foundation of the first royal dynasties, to a time when it seems the very structure of Egyptian society was in the making. Here, three of the key elements that would later define that civilization were just emerging in the greatest social experiment the Nile Valley has ever seen. In the following 2,000 years, these would then fuse to make what we know today as ancient Egypt.
So later there must have been a merging of these burial traditions.
Society had reached a point in time where they had just decided the experimentation was over. Someone decided that this would be the way. And this would be the way they would do it for the next 3,000 years. And I think was as far as mummification is concerned, at about 3,000, society reached critical mass, and that's just the way it was going to be.
This then was the moment of the birth of ancient Egypt. But who was making the decisions as to how things would be? Were there powerful rulers, people giving orders, like the pharaohs? Rennie has found evidence that suggests there were, not in the form of royal regalia, but in the graves of pampered pets. This exotic collection of animals hints at the past times of Egypt's first wealthy elite.
This is our elephant. This is one of two elephants that we have that are surrounding our elite tombs. They appear to have been pets that the elite kept. And what a better way to show your wealth than to keeping elephants.
So how do we know that these are pets and haven't been hunted?
Well, this elephant in particular was buried with great honors. It wasn't just a hunting trophy. It was given pottery, fine decorated pottery. It had a number of fine vessels that were purchased specifically for inclusion in its grave. It had even an ivory bracelet, as well as a number of beads.
So would you say that these are the pets of proto-pharaohs?
I'll go for it. I have no problem with that. I think they were already pharaohs, personally.
Right.
So these people, with their magical symbols, funerary masks, first attempts at mummification, and emerging wealthy elite, were the ancestors of the pyramid builders, living 1,200 years before any pyramid was built.
Can the site take us any further back in time?
Oh yes, we can go much further back than this.
A few kilometers away from the main dig is a grassy swampland where local villagers graze their animals. It was here that another remarkable discovery came to light.
So what have you found in this section of the site then?
Well, this is where we made excavations in 1984. And we started off with a house dating from about 3000 BC, First Dynasty. And we thought that's when this part of the settlement began. But we made excavations below it, and we went a full 4 meters below the water table and never hit sterile soil. There was occupation all the way down. So that's about 6 meters below where we're standing right now.
So the site hasn't been abandoned at all at any
It was
point?
never abandoned. And at the very bottom of these cores, we found some of the earliest evidence for occupation we have here. These are sherds from dating to about 4500 BC.
Wow.
Very distinctive with their rippled texture. So we know exactly when they date to, just by the type of pottery that they are.
So that's 6,500 years of archaeology?
Stratified right here, yes.
So the evidence shows that the origins of Egyptian culture started right here in the Nile Valley?
Absolutely. There was certainly habitation from about 5000 BC, if not earlier. It's just that we have trouble finding the evidence because it's so deeply buried. But there's no question that it was definitely here.
The work at Hierakonpolis has pushed the origins of ancient Egypt back in time, an astonishing 2,500 years before the pyramids were built. In that time, the people of the Nile developed their key rituals and symbols. They learned to preserve their dead as mummies, buried their rulers in elaborate masks, and evoked their gods to carry them to the afterlife in the solar boats they had first imagined on the rock galleries of El Kab.
How well do you think we've done?
You know, what really convinced me were those very early finds, which showed that there were people here in the Nile Valley 6,000 years ago.
Yeah, 1,000 years before the pyramids. That's plenty of time for this great civilization to develop.
Yeah, just think how much the world has changed in the last 100.
So the founders of Egyptian civilization were not the exotic foreigners imagined by 19th century explorers, but the native peoples of Egypt, the people of Nekhen and Negev. For the Egypt detectives, it's case closed. Egypt belongs to the Egyptians, and her monuments stand testimony to thousands of years of advance and innovation by her founders and future, the people of the Nile. It was the archaeological find of the century, perhaps the greatest single discovery of all time.
Today, Tutankhamun's hoard remains the Cairo Museum's biggest draw. Millions have gazed awestruck at these incredible finds.
But these dazzling treasures have blinded generations of archaeologists to a startling fact that could change our understanding of this most famous pharaoh forever. For there is something surprising about the contents of this tomb.
If you look closely at that material, you'll see that something like 80% of that material was never made with Tutankhamun in mind.
These are not Tutankhamun's treasures, so why are they in his tomb? To solve the riddle, Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook investigate the very strange life and death of Tutankhamun. Luxor, on the east bank of the River Nile. In the pharaoh Tutankhamun's lifetime, he would have known this city as Thebes, his religious capital and home to the great Karnak temple, devoted to the worship of his own favored god, Amun. This was where the young pharaoh came to praise the god from whom he took his name, Tutankhamun, the living image of the Amun, and where the pharaoh himself was revered as a living god. This was also the place where the body of the king, dead at just 20 years of age, began its extraordinary journey into an eventful afterlife in 1322 BC. From here sailed the remains of this minor pharaoh, who should, were it not for a quirk of fate, have been relegated to complete obscurity. It was a short journey across the Nile to the west bank, the land of the dead, to join his ancestors who inhabited the lavish royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings. By the time archaeologists began to rediscover these tombs in the 19th century, most had been robbed of their contents, but one somehow had been missed, Tutankhamun's. Inside was a dazzling array of everyday objects and golden treasures. Gold, which never tarnished, and which the pharaohs believed touched them with immortality. But for all their fame, this vault and its treasures have only very recently been examined in detail, and the story they're beginning to tell is as rare and strange as the objects themselves.
It's been called the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and millions of people have seen it worldwide, but there's still an awful lot that we don't understand about Tutankhamun's tomb.
It's remarkable that so little analysis has been done on the contents of the tomb.
Yeah, it's as though archaeologists have been so overwhelmed with the sheer amount of material that they've just described it rather than looking at it in any detail. It's possible that there might be something really odd about Tutankhamun's tomb.
What makes this neglect all the more surprising is that Howard Carter, the archaeologist who first set eyes on the tomb, knew immediately that there was something very strange about what he'd uncovered. Carter discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, after a long and frustrating search in the Valley of the Kings. It was the discovery of a lifetime, a tomb sealed shut for 3,000 years, and a glimpse of an ancient world that time itself had passed by. Treasure after treasure was unearthed. Chariots, gilded sarcophagi, wrapped in the cold embrace of stone goddesses, exquisite thrones and chairs, collections of models and miniature boats. As a result of this unique discovery, Tutankhamun, a pharaoh otherwise destined for obscurity, suddenly became one of the most celebrated of all ancient Egyptians. But Carter remained disturbed by what he'd discovered, as his notebooks show.
Carter recorded his discovery of the tomb in 1922 in great detail. These notebooks are a real goldmine. It's only now that we're beginning to fully realize how insightful he was.
A number of things bothered Carter about the discovery. He knew that royal tombs were usually begun in the lifetime of the pharaoh to allow time for the cutting and decorating of a vast and elaborate series of galleries and burial chambers from the rock of the valley floor. Egyptian texts also made it clear that the finished tomb then had to be filled with personal items from the pharaoh's life, which they believed he would take with him into the next world. Finally, the pharaoh who succeeded had to ensure that this was done, and that the funeral followed precisely the required rites, so his predecessor would arrive safely in the afterlife, and then he could take the throne of Egypt. But this was not how Tutankhamun was buried.
He noticed how small and how peculiarly laid out the tomb was in relation to other kings' tombs in the Valley of the Kings. He also noticed a strange pile of debris at the foot of the great sarcophagus, which suggested that the coffins inside had been cut down.
Could the coffins have been made for someone else, then adapted? In ancient Egypt, this should have been unthinkable. Pharaohs had to be buried with their own possessions. Carter's conclusion was radical.
All in all, Carter thought, Tutankhamun had been buried with a job lot of other people's stuff.
Howard Carter died before he could discover if Tutankhamun really did have a second-hand tomb. And since then, few archaeologists working in the Valley of the Kings have been inspired to follow up his nagging suspicion. Now, finally, one has. Dr. Nicholas Reeves.
He obviously went through all the pieces in the tomb. He looked at everything. He catalogued most of it. I don't think he really fully grasped the implications of all of this. I really don't think anybody has done.
But why has the world's most famous archaeological find been ignored?
I think a lot of professional Egyptologists have considered Tutankhamun's tomb to be rather vulgar, populist, therefore not really worthy of serious consideration. Just a glamorous assemblage of material with no historical implications or ramifications.
So Reeves decided to look beyond the gold and the glamour to see if he could find the other story hiding in the treasures of Tutankhamun.
In the mid-1990s, I started going through the material again and noticed that there was, in fact, something more to be said about Tutankhamun's tomb.
Right.
If you look closely at that material, you'll see that something like 80% of that material was never made with Tutankhamun in mind. It was second-hand material which Tutankhamun had taken over for his own use.
And Reeves' discovery doesn't just affect the smaller finds. It may radically alter our view of the greatest treasure of all.
It's the quintessential object of Tutankhamun. You look at it closely, though, I think that the mask was never made for Tutankhamun at all. I think it was reused for Tutankhamun. The reason I say that is because if you look behind, underneath the back of the mask, as it's now displayed in the Cairo Museum, you see that there is a solder mark running down the side of the face, along the neck, and up and across. I think the face has been replaced. I think that that mask was originally made for another king and reused for Tutankhamun.
So who originally stared out from behind the mask of Tutankhamun? Egypt detectives Miriam Cook and Dominic Montserrat are investigating the puzzle of Tutankhamun's tomb. The young king seems to have been buried in an unusually small tomb with a job lot of other people's possessions. Even his most famous golden mask may not originally have been his. So whose was it? Archaeologist Nick Reeves has come to a dramatic conclusion.
I think the face has been replaced. I think that that mask was originally made for another king and reused for Tutankhamun.
My own feeling is that the mask was originally made for Akhenaton.
This is an astonishing claim. Akhenaton was Tutankhamun's father and Egypt's most notorious ruler. In his lifetime, he abandoned the old gods and unleashed a cultural revolution that left his country and people in chaos. After his death, his successors immediately set about reversing everything he'd done. So why would Tutankhamun be buried beneath his hated father's mask?
All good detective stories begin with a dark secret in the past. And in this case, all the leads take us back to the city of Amarna.
Amarna, the desert city built by Akhenaton, hundreds of miles from Egypt's traditional capitals of Memphis and Thebes, and Tutankhamun's own dark secret. This was where Tutankhamun probably grew up, in the city at the heart of his father's revolution. It must have been a turbulent childhood, one in which thousands of years of certainty and belief were swept away with ferocious zeal, and the young prince found himself protected only by the rays of the new god, the sun disk of the Aten. Could the fate of this lost city provide the vital clue in solving the mystery of Tutankhamun's tomb? It's time for the detectives to compare notes.
Tutankhamun is really pretty important in terms of his family background.
Go on.
Well, we don't know for sure who his mother was, but she may have been Nefertiti, the wife of the pharaoh Akhenaton, who threw Egypt into turmoil with his religious reforms.
And overturned the old gods, including Amun, and moved the whole capital city from Thebes down to this new site at Amarna.
Right, and that's where Tutankhamun is born, not under that name, but as Tutankhaten, with a name honouring his father's god, the Aten, or deified sun disk.
And then Akhenaton dies, and within a few years, Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun.
Amun, exactly. And I think the whole mystery of Tutankhamun's burial lies in that change of name.
The boy who carried his religion in his very name had been born into his father's religion and dedicated to the Aten, but by his death bore the name of the old god, Amun. But his father had said that Amun was dead, so how had Tutankhamun brought this god back to life? The detectives set out for the Luxor temple to look for evidence. Built by Tutankhamun's grandfather, it was dedicated to the ancient god, Amun. Yet these are images of Tutankhamun himself, engraved on this temple when he was king. And they show him doing something extraordinary, something his father would have despised.
There you are.
This corner of the temple is full of images of Tutankhamun. They're quite damaged, though.
Yeah, they're not very clear. Although I can make out that it's Tutankhamun. And he's wearing the horns of a moon.
Isn't that extraordinary?
By wearing the horns of a moon, Tutankhamun was completely rejecting his father's religious revolution. To him, Amun was clearly not dead.
But there's Tutankhamun again. He's burning incense. And that's Amun, the god his father turned his back on.
They're returning to the old gods. Tutankhamun's changing Egypt now.
But if Tutankhamun had turned his back on his father's religion and restored the old gods, that makes the borrowed contents of his tomb even more baffling. For amongst the thousands of objects stacked inside are many relics from his father's city of Amarna.
If we look closely at this throne here, we can see an Aten or a sun disk on its back. Now this was a symbol of a failed religious experiment that was over when Tutankhamun was a baby.
The answer to this riddle has been found by Nick Reeves in another puzzling tomb in the Valley of the Kings, known simply as Tomb 55. This was first found by Edward Ayrton in 1907, and like Tutankhamun's tomb, it was packed with strange objects from Amarna.
What I was interested in was the relationship between Tutankhamun's tomb and this odd cache tomb, Tomb 55. And it's when I started working through the material again first principles that I saw that there was in fact a connection between Tutankhamun's tomb and Tomb 55. And that connection explains what had been going on.
The items Arten discovered should have been buried at Amarna, but someone had clearly brought them back after that city was abandoned. Amongst those remains, there is a clue to just who that might have been. Items from Tutankhamun's own reign are mixed up with the cache. Perhaps he had returned them to Thebes. But who then had buried him with these inappropriate relics of the dead religion of his childhood? That answer may also lie in the Valley of the Kings, in a peculiar collection of objects recovered from a site called Tomb 54.
It's a whodunit. We need to discover who was in power when Tutankhamun died, because they would have been the people organizing his burial.
Well, we've got an important clue right here.
Well, what is it?
It was used to store the leftovers from Tutankhamun's burials.
Amongst the torn pieces of linen left over from his mummification were clues identifying his main mourners.
And amongst them were jars that had the funeral meals of the mourners. And these show us that there were only a handful of people here at the burial.
From these names recovered at this site, two immediately stand out for Dominic.
First of all, there's Akhenaton, the widow, because you always suspect the widow first in a detective story. And then there's Ai, an older man who's been around the centers of power for a long time, since before Tutankhamun was even born.
These were names from Amarna, from Tutankhamun's turbulent childhood. Ai had been one of his father's right-hand men, whilst Ankhenaton was a daughter of Akhenaton and the wife of Tutankhamun. So what was their role in the mystery of Tutankhamun's tomb? The solution lies in the tomb itself. 80 years ago, Howard Carter became the first man to gaze on this burial place for almost 3,500 years. And the answer to the riddle was written, had he but known it, all around him.
So we're right at the heart of the mystery here. This is Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, and his body is still inside here. And we need to find out what was happening at his burial 3,300 years ago.
Well, there's a clue in this part of the wall painting. Here's Tutankhamun, and he's receiving the opening of the mouth ceremony. It's a ceremony which will enable him to speak words in the next world and so be reborn. But look who's performing it for him. It's Ai.
But that's usually done by the son of the dead person. So Ai is placing himself in the role of successor.
Well, it's more than that. This cartouche shows that he's already pharaoh. That's the prerogative of kings. And we know from other evidence that by this time he's already married Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhenaton. Here she is.
So we have our two suspects right here, Ai and the widow of Tutankhamun.
Away from the heat of the Valley of the Kings, it's time for the Egypt detectives to work out their next move.
Well, we know that Tutankhamun was buried with a strange collection of his forebears' possessions relating to the failed religious experiment at Amarna.
And we also know that his widow, Ankhenaton, and Ai, her new husband and the new pharaoh, are organizing this rather odd burial.
So we have our two suspects, but now we need a motive.
That motive has to lie somewhere in the past lives of Ai and Ankhenaton themselves. Lives that lead back to Amarna. This was where Ai first thought he would be buried, and the strange tomb he began here holds clues to what brought him back to Thebes and onto the throne. This is the tomb I started but never finished, and it tells us a lot about this great survivor of ancient Egyptian politics. When work began here, Ai was closely involved in Akhenaton's new religion and lauded his king and his new god on the walls of his tomb. But when the pharaoh died, his people deserted his revolution, and so Ai deserted his faith and this site with them. Ai was a realist, not a revolutionary, and he quickly saw that Akhenaton had left a people traumatized by religious persecutions and bankrupted by his suppression of the old temples. To survive, he would have to return to the old faith and the old city of Thebes.
The Egyptian temples were the powerhouses of the Egyptian economy. So if someone like Akhenaton comes along and closes down all the temples and takes over their assets, then this is making quite a considerable economic statement, and it is economic suicide.
But if I helped Tutankhamun to restore the old religion and the economy, then why did he bury him with so many reminders of his tragic and dangerous Amarna past? The answer, according to Reeves, lies in Tutankhamun's own untimely death. After 10 years on the throne, the young pharaoh suddenly died at the age of just 20. For it was a disaster. He had planned to rule Egypt next, but plans for Tutankhamun's burial were still years away from completion.
Well, when you think about the position that I must have found himself in, he wanted to succeed. And in order to succeed to the throne, an Egyptian king has to prepare for his predecessor, proper Egyptian burial. The difficulty was that Tutankhamun had died young and presumably unexpectedly. I suppose we can assume that there wasn't really time to have prepared anything. And so it came as a shock, and I was faced with a problem.
There had been no time to finish or even start a suitable royal tomb for Tutankhamun. So it seems, ordered an existing tomb designed for a lesser noble to be adapted. This might explain why the king's final resting place is so small, but so beautifully finished. Now he just had to fill it with the traditional items necessary for the king's afterlife.
What does I do to solve the problem that he's faced with of having to give Tutankhamun an effective royal burial?
Well, I think he was lucky because he was faced with this problem at the time when they decided already to dismantle the royal tomb at Amarna and ship all that material back to Thebes.
Akhenaton and his family had originally been buried at Amarna. But after the city was abandoned, someone, perhaps Tutankhamun himself, ordered his family's royal mummies and burial goods be brought back to Thebes.
What they did was to bring all the burial equipment back to Thebes, put it in a pile. From this pile, they cherry-picked the pieces they needed for Tutankhamun's burial, and what was left over, was then redivided out amongst the people who it originally belonged to.
I had to hurry if he was to succeed, and he needed funeral goods immediately. The Amarna items, for all their tragic connotations, were available, and so he used them. The treasures of the discredited father would have to fill the tomb of the son who betrayed him.
We found out that Tutankhamun was buried with other people's possessions because there wasn't any time to manufacture his own.
These treasures would have been destroyed if they hadn't have been kept safe in Tutankhamun's tomb.
Tutankhamun's tomb is more than a treasure, for amongst the gold and glory lies the story of a forgotten time. It would be nearly 3,500 years before light would shine again on these treasures, and only now are we just beginning to piece together the silent story they tell. The tale of a pharaoh who betrayed his father's dream in life, but who accidentally preserved this memory in death, locked in his own grave.
5,000 years ago, the Egyptians invented something astonishing: the pyramid. For 100 years, the Egyptians continued to build more pyramids, always very close to the first one. Every one of these was a huge construction, requiring thousands of workers and millions of tons of raw material. And then suddenly, for no apparent reason, they moved the whole operation north to a brand new site.
But the pharaohs were not simply content to change site once. Despite huge logistical problems, they kept changing location in the Nile Valley. Something very powerful was driving them to ceaselessly choose new places to build pyramids. But what was it? To investigate this mystery, Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat and archaeologist Miriam Cook go on the trail of the wandering pyramids. To trace hundreds of years of pyramid building, the Egypt detectives have taken to their mobile headquarters, letting the river take the strain of carrying them between the sites. For the pharaohs building those monuments, however, things were not so simple. Each time a new location was chosen, a whole city of laborers, stonemasons, architects, and surveyors had to be moved, resettled, and supplied. The whole extraordinary project had begun, logically enough, close to the ancient capital, Memphis, from where building work could easily be overseen. But then, quite suddenly, that site was abandoned in favor of a new location at Giza. But even here, the pharaohs were not content, and they moved again, and again, and yet again, eventually ending up close to where the whole project had started, at Saqqara. For years, experts have argued over whether it was purely practical considerations or some deeper religious reason that drove the moves. Why isn't there just one great pyramid field where each pharaoh could rest surrounded by his predecessors? Archaeologists have not yet reached a consensus, and the Egypt detectives are no exception.
This is the situation we have. This is the pyramids at Saqqara, of the Nile, and then the move up to Giza. And we need to explain why.
Well, these are religious monuments. The Egyptians are incredibly particular about their sacred spaces. So I wonder if there isn't some religious aspect of the Giza plateau that influences the relocation.
Dominic's years of research suggest to him a religious explanation, but Miriam is after archaeological evidence. Was it significant that the first pyramid built at the new northerly location was the massive Great Pyramid?
Building the Great Pyramid was the most challenging engineering feat that they'd ever attempted. The puzzle must have something to do with that. The move north must have solved engineering or structural problems.
Well, what problems?
Well, that's what we need to find out.
To discover what practical considerations drove pharaohs to choose a pyramid site, Miriam has decided to look more closely at the construction and location of the earliest pyramid of all, built around 2650 BC at Saqqara. This was the first in what would soon become an essential part of the pharaoh's burial rite. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was resurrected as Osiris, king of the dead. So to ensure his smooth transition into the afterlife, great care was taken not only with mummifying his body, but also with providing him with a suitable tomb from which he could ascend to heaven. This was the origin of the pyramids.
The Egyptians were great pragmatists. Take this first pyramid right behind me here at Saqqara. It's called the Step Pyramid, and it looks very different to the other pyramids. Its sides are stepped, not smooth. And it's these very steps that tell a story.
Before this pyramid was built, the elite of ancient Egypt were buried in flat roof tombs called mastabas.
Look at this first step. It's obviously the first thing to be built. And the incredible thing is they could have stopped right here. Without going any further, they'd already created a low-lying flat-roofed tomb called a mastaba. Until the Step Pyramid, the kings had been very happy to be buried within these mastabas. So the builders could have packed up their tools and gone home. But they didn't. They had an inspiration. Why not build big and place more mastabas on top of the first? And that's just what they did. And then they built another, and then another, and then another.
And the result was the very first pyramid.
I think the evolution of all the pyramids was the result of these practical what-if experiments. The ancient Egyptians became increasingly ambitious, testing the limits of their skills and their raw materials.
But Dominic isn't easily convinced by the practical argument. He's searching for a deeper spiritual answer among Egypt's ancient religious records. Miriam, meanwhile, went in search of a concrete example to prove her point. Could she unearth practical reasons why the pharaoh Khufu had first decided to move away from Saqqara and build far to the north at Giza? find out, she has arranged to meet a leading Egyptian geologist, Dr. Bache Asawi, to discover more about the ancient Egyptians' most essential raw material.
And limestone was used in building all of the pyramids. What makes it such a perfect building material?
It's very durable kind of rock, and secondly, Egypt is very rich in limestone. And third, that it has layering and jointing, which help quarrying the types of limestone.
So the layers actually dictate the size of the blocks?
Yes, certainly, and you can see the layers. This is the size, this is the maximum size. The rocks can be cut from these layers.
So the pharaoh Khufu's grand plans could have been limited by the size and availability of the limestone blocks at Saqqara.
So when they wanted to build a bigger pyramid, they were actually limited by the raw material here?
Yeah, and not only this, but also because of the space also. You don't have quite a good space here to build bigger pyramids. And
so they had to go to a different place?
Oh, yeah, indeed they did.
After almost 100 years of pyramid building at Saqqara, the new pharaoh Khufu found the site could not cope with his ambition to build the greatest pyramid of all time. So he moved his entire operation north to Giza.
Well, we're here at Giza. What made this a better place to build?
If you look at the stones behind you, you find that you have several layers of rocks.
And this limestone is a lot more easy to get out.
Yes,
then.
the joints on both sides, and then the bedding planes, then you can easily pull the rock from its original place.
So are these unfinished blocks?
Yeah, that's how they do it, you see, by chiseling along the joints by harder rocks. And that's how they cut this into big pieces, of course, depending on the joints and on the bedding planes. And that's why they came here, because it's bigger blocks than any other place in the area.
Dr. Desawi's theory suggests that it was the availability of larger stone blocks and a greater expanse of flat ground on which to build that persuaded Khufu to abandon the burial site of his ancestors and move to Giza. Practical reasons from a practical pharaoh.
Giza was the perfect place. Plenty of limestone blocks to work with and a solid base upon which to begin building one of the wonders of the world, the Great Pyramid.
How do you account for the next pyramid? They didn't build that here at Giza, but miles away over there at Abu Ruash.
I don't see the problem with that. There was plenty of good limestone up there as well.
Well, bear with me. We'll go on up to Abu Ruash, and I'll show you a more powerful reason than geology for building pyramids up here in the north.
Simple geology might explain why building moved from Saqqara to Giza. But what Miriam can't explain is why the next pharaoh then abandoned this apparently perfect site and moved again. Perhaps it's time to see if Dominic really can discover more compelling answers deep in Egypt's ancient religion. Egypt detectives are trying to discover why pharaohs built the pyramids where they did. But competing theories mean tensions are rising. Miriam Cook, an archaeologist, is drawn towards a practical geological solution, while Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat believes the location of the pyramids is the key to a greater mystery, whose solution lies in the religious beliefs of the pharaohs themselves. So why, after the Great Pyramid was built at Giza, did the next pharaoh, Djedefre, move the building operation yet again to Abu Ruash?
Well, you've brought me here to Abu Ruash, and I'm standing on the pyramid, but it doesn't look very finished to me.
That's right, it probably never was finished. It's always seemed like an odd thing to do, to come all the way up here to build if there's all that marvellous building stone on the Giza plateau. I just don't find the geological argument accounts for everything.
Well, how would you explain it then, Dominic?
Well, if we'd been standing up here 4,500 years ago, we'd have been able to see Heliopolis, and I think that's a really important clue.
And why is that?
Well, if you buy me a cup of coffee, I might just tell you.
OK, you're on.
Heliopolis, the center of sun worship in ancient Egypt and the city at the heart of the pharaoh's beliefs. A city now lost in suburban sprawl. But what has this to do with pyramids?
Well, I've got your coffee here, but first I want you to explain why you think Heliopolis is so important for the move to Abu Roash and Giza.
If you look at the names of the pharaohs who built at Giza and Abu Roash, you see something really interesting. Because first of all, you've got Jedefre at Abu Roash, and then Khephren.
And Menkaure, who built the third pyramid at Giza.
Menkaure, exactly. And what have these three pharaohs all got in common? Re in their names.
The sun god Re was clearly central to the beliefs of these pharaohs, so much so that they even adopted his name. For them, he was the god who sailed across the sky in his solar boat by day and across the underworld of the dead by night. When they died, these kings also believed they would join him on this journey, a journey that would begin when their bodies were laid to rest in their immortal monument, their pyramid.
Well, Heliopolis was the city of the sun, wasn't it? They must have been worshippers of his cult because they all chose names which honored him.
Well, you can have your coffee now.
Oh, thank you.
But we still know so little about Heliopolis.
Well, that's right. It's just a suburb of modern Cairo now. Might be worth checking out.
The site of Heliopolis today has been overwhelmed by the suburbs of Cairo. But do any clues survive to link these sun pharaohs with their sun city? And can these provide a solution more compelling than Miriam's?
Get a good view from up here. The entrance road is right around.
Miriam has arranged to meet Dr. David Jeffries, a veteran archaeologist who spent years trying to unravel the secrets of the lost city of Heliopolis and its connections to the cult of sun worship. David takes Miriam to a place right in the center of what was the ancient city, where they can get a bird's eye view of the area.
Whew, you okay? Right. Well, it's definitely worth the climb. We've got a wonderful view from up here. We're looking over the town and temple area of Heliopolis.
At first, the view from the minaret made Heliopolis seem even more mysterious. One of the greatest religious complexes of ancient Egypt, engulfed by urban sprawl and smothered with haze. But in the mist, there is a clue. An obelisk, built many years after the pyramids, but linked to the days of the pyramid builders. Archaeologists have discovered that it marks the original site of the massive, long-lost sun temple devoted to the worship of the sun god Re. After years of research, David Jeffries has put together a theory to explain why pyramid building sites were changed.
Right, well, here's the obelisk. In order to be comfortable, shall we just go over into the shade?
I think that's a good idea.
Discuss this. Yeah. Right, well, we're standing here in Sun City. To find a spot out of the sun, at least. Let's talk about it here.
So if we've got a huge sun temple and pharaohs who are building pyramids who are associated with the sun cult, what's the link?
Well, it's interesting because the whole question of the distribution of pyramids is not really well understood. They seem to skip about in an almost random way.
Yeah.
But one thing that is significant is that when the sun cult becomes important to the royal family, they move to Giza and then to Abu Roash, and really that's when the connection with the sun cult becomes really clear.
Right.
Ra-Jedef, who is the first one to have Ra, the sun, Re, the sun, in his name, and to call himself the son of the sun, he builds at Abu Roash, which is the most clearly visible from where we are at Heliopolis. And then all the Giza pyramids are in a direct line of sight with Heliopolis.
4,500 years ago, the pharaohs would have been able to see the sun temple here at Heliopolis from their pyramids at Giza and Abu Roash. David Jeffries believes that this view from tomb to temple was central to their religion. But not everywhere across the Nile had such a clear view. On the outskirts of Cairo stands an escarpment known as the Citadel Rock. This would have blocked the view of the Sun Temple at Heliopolis from many locations across the river. So perhaps the pharaohs that followed the sun cult were choosing the location of their tombs in order to ensure that they did have a view of Heliopolis.
So it's all about lines of sight?
It could well be, yes.
For the followers of the sun cult, so the theory goes, seeing really was believing. As the pharaohs became more obsessed with worshipping the sun, they had to choose pyramid sites which would guarantee a good view of the center of Heliopolis. So the pharaoh Jedefre had built his pyramid at Abu Ruash to ensure he had a clear view of the temple of his favored god, Re. The next pharaoh, Khafre, went back to Giza, as did his successor, Menkaure, but both chose sites where they still had a clear line of sight with Heliopolis. But the map also shows a weak link in this theory.
I think that there's a problem with this lines of sight theory of David Jeffreys. The next three pharaohs built their pyramids back near Saqqara at this place called Abu Sir, and they were still worshipping the sun god Re. But the problem is that the line of sight between Abu Sir and the Sun Temple at Heliopolis is blocked by the Citadel Rock.
So, is David Jeffreys wrong? Why did the pyramid builders at Abu Sir choose a site with no clear view of this vital temple? Miriam decides to invite him to Abu Sir to see if he had an explanation. But he suggests they actually meet just a few miles northeast of the pyramid site, among the ruins of another extraordinary building.
And where we're standing is the key site. We're actually on top of the Sun Temple now. We only know of two of them as it is. We're standing on the actual tower of the Sun Temple.
So what's that structure down there for?
Right, well, rather like a pyramid, the Sun Temple is surrounded by its own temple complex. And what we're looking at is really a unique structure. We don't have anything quite like it from anywhere else in Egypt. And it's an altar of what is sometimes called Egyptian alabaster or travertine, consisting of 4 segments that are actually a hieroglyphic sign. It's the offering table with a loaf of bread on it, the sign for Hetep, which means to be satisfied or to make offerings.
With its rows of pens for hundreds of sacrificial animals and huge basins for collecting their blood, it was a very substantial and hence important structure. And most significantly of all, from its top, there is a clear line of sight to the pyramids at Abu Sir. But this wasn't the central Sun Temple at Heliopolis that previous pharaohs had gone to such lengths to be in sight of. So Miriam still needs an answer.
Even when the kings are building at Abu Sir, the point really is this question of visibility from the center of the sun cult itself at Heliopolis. The Abu Sir pyramids are out of sight from Heliopolis.
In building back near their capital at Memphis, these pharaohs had seemingly sacrificed that all-important view, a view previous rulers had gone to huge lengths to protect.
Just to the south of Heliopolis, south of Cairo, you've got this promontory that sort of sticks out from the main cliff line where the Islamic citadel was built. We call it the Citadel Rock. And that interrupts the line of sight between Heliopolis and the Abu Sir pyramids, even though the Abu Sir pyramids are sun kings, but their pyramids are back close to Memphis and they cannot be seen from the center of the sun cult. But the Sun Temple can.
The pyramids at Abu Sir would have had a view of this, their own Sun Temple, which itself then had a direct line of sight to Heliopolis. What David is suggesting was that this temple created a visual link, a relay between the Abusir pyramids and Heliopolis. It is an ingenious solution to the pharaoh's problem of building near their physical capital of Memphis, but also maintaining their connection with their spiritual home at Heliopolis. A uniquely Egyptian answer to reconciling the physical problems of pyramid building with the spiritual demands of the gods. This was the truth behind the riddle of the pyramids. Egyptian kings chose their burial places with an eye to the gods, but also with concern for the massive logistical effort involved in building these legendary structures. Building a pyramid could be a lifetime's work for thousands of people, from stonecutters to priests. But in undertaking such colossal enterprises, everyone knew they had to balance the physical needs of the construction with the spiritual requirements of the pharaoh. Together, these, in the form of the pyramid, ensured Egypt would itself remain a wonder of the world. It's time for the Egypt detectives to compare notes and see whose theory is right.
Well, I must admit, I did think that the whole pyramid building business was to do with geology and building blocks, but David has convinced me there's more to it.
I had a feeling it wasn't as straightforward as your geological argument.
Yeah, but don't forget that the first move to Giza was about limestone and space, and not sunkults.
Fair enough. So we're both right.
Yep, chin chin.
Mummies are among the most celebrated creations of ancient Egypt. Invented to preserve the dead for eternity, many mysteries still surround them. Now Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat and archaeologist Miriam Cook investigate one of the most remarkable mummy puzzles of all.
For more than 3,000 years, the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead and buried them in style. But they didn't just mummify people. They used their skill to do something very odd indeed.
In a labyrinth of tunnels dug deep beneath the pyramids, there is a whole other world. It is stuffed full of animal mummies.
Why on earth did the ancient Egyptians mummify so many animals?
Saqqara, near modern Cairo. This was the burial ground of the pharaohs. Over 4,500 years ago, the very first pyramids were built and kept safe deep inside with the mummies of kings. But beneath these pyramids was another far more mysterious world. A dark labyrinth of tunnels and huge, elaborately decorated sarcophagi. This was the last resting place not of kings, but of bulls, all mummified. Elsewhere beneath Saqqara, another astonishing discovery was made. Yet more tunnels containing thousands of clay jars. Inside were mummified animals, including hawks, ibises, and baboons. Here lies a mystery, a secret world of mummified animals, literally millions of them. But why? On the Nile, heading towards Cairo, Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and archaeologist Miriam Cook discuss the puzzle and where to start.
I wonder why they're doing it. I mean, mummifying humans implies some sort of desire to preserve them for eternity so that they can be reborn, but animals?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense for animals, unless they were considered as important as humans.
Yeah.
Mummification of humans was essential to Egyptian religion. After death, the soul depended on the preservation of its physical body for all its needs. The Egyptians developed highly sophisticated techniques, using oils and resins, to preserve the appearance of the dead person. The ancient Egyptians were mummifying humans and animals. The question was, were they treated in the same way after death? The Egypt detectives decided to follow different leads. Dominic headed off to see one of the biggest collections of animal mummies in the world, at the Cairo Museum. He arranged to meet a leading expert on animal mummification, Dr. Salima Ikram.
So, Salima, why does one mummify anything?
Well, the ancient Egyptians believed that by mummifying something, it would last for eternity, so it could live forever, which is why they mummified.
Right, but that makes the whole animal mummy question more complicated, doesn't it? Because there's such an array of animals here.
Yeah. In fact, this is a wonderful cobra, little crocodiles, crocodile eggs. That one actually has a small crocodile in it, sort of curled up. And we've got this fabulous eagle, which is gilded, and another falcon as well.
And what's over here?
Over here we've got tons more. We've got dog and cat.
And were any of these pets?
No, but we in fact do have a pet over here. Come and see.
They still have hunting dogs like this in Egypt with curly tails. And look, he was found with this wonderful baboon who was found with his arms folded like this, just looking woefully up at the dogs. He's really sweet.
And what are these?
These are really unusual. These are food mummies. The ancient Egyptians believed that if you wanted something, you could take it with you. So, for example, if you liked your Sunday roast, you could order a roast dozen and have them mummified, wrapped up, and then put in your tomb so you could enjoy them for eternity.
So pets, Sunday joints, what's the common denominator?
The majority of animal mummies that we have were like this crocodile. It was sacred.
For the ancient Egyptians, crocodiles were sacred because they were the earthly form of a god, and they weren't the only animals worshipped in ancient Egypt. At one of the most important temples in Egypt, there was evidence of the significance of animals in Egyptian society and religion, and it was etched all over the walls.
Animals are everywhere in Egyptian culture. On this temple wall, I can see a row of baboons here. There's 2 snakes above them. And over there's a lioness. There's a vulture. These are just a few members of this sacred zoo. It's these animal gods that make Egyptian culture so unique.
Some animals were almost like pharaohs.
This is the hawk god Horus. He's always associated with the pharaohs. This is because hawks appear to fly so close to the sun, and pharaohs are the sons of Re, the sons of the sun. This statue of Horus shows him as a pharaoh as well as a hawk, and that's his crown.
Some animals were linked to pharaohs and were worshipped as gods. But how were they treated in death? Pharaohs were mummified with great care. Could the same be said of sacred animals? To find out, Dominic and Miriam turned to Dr. Stephen Buckley, based in Britain. He has spent years analysing the chemicals and materials used in the complex Egyptian process of mummification. Stephen has been unwrapping animal mummies and using state-of-the-art chemical analysis to work out how they were mummified, then comparing this process to the one used on human mummies. The detectives knew that Stephen had been working on mummified hawks, the animal used to represent the god Horus.
I'll see if I can get him online.
Is this going to work?
I don't know, we can only try.
His work turned out to confirm what they suspected.
Here you're seeing plant oils and beeswax being mixed together, which is also what we see in many of the elite human mummies at this time. The care and attention taken with this hook suggests that they were looking at this as being a representation of the particular deity of Horus.
So the evidence showed that after death, the ancient Egyptians did use the same highly sophisticated techniques to mummify sacred animals, like hawks, as they did humans. And according to Egypt's leading expert, Dr. Zahi Hawaz, the ancient Egyptians saw their gods within animals.
You know, you have to understand the religion of ancient Egypt. And the religion of ancient Egypt, that the Egyptian looked at animal as sacred and divine, because animals did play an important part in the life of the ancient Egyptian. When the Egyptian mummify a cow and worship a cow, it did not mean that the Egyptian worshipped the cow. They worshipped what is in the cow. The Egyptian looked at what is in the animal to worship, the brilliance and the divine.
The sacred brilliance of animals seemed to burn brightest near the pyramids of the pharaohs at Saqqara. Here, the Egyptians dug a vast network of tunnels which burrow deep into the ground and date back to about 1400 BC. The Serapeum is a remarkable piece of engineering, and it was devoted to a single god, a god who took the form of an animal, the Apis bull. And Dr. Salima Ikram took Dominic straight into their world.
This is the most extraordinary place.
It's pretty fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So long, dark tunnels. Do you know there are about 3 kilometers of tunnels here?
No idea at all.
During its life, the Apis bull was one of the most pampered living creatures in Egypt. After a ceremonial selection process, the chosen bull was provided with its own temple, and even servants, and a harem of cows. When the Apis bull died, its body was treated with great reverence.
And there are these side chapels off.
Yeah, there are lots and lots of side chapels that go all the way around, which are places where the bulls are buried.
At the climax of its funeral, the body of the bull was carried through these corridors and placed inside one of the most impressive funeral monuments in Egypt.
Here it is.
Good heavens. That is colossal.
It's really huge. Would you mind lighting me down, please?
Of course not.
This is a sarcophagus for one of the sacred Apis bulls.
Why spend all this time, money, and engineering expertise on a bull?
During their lifetime, they would be oracles, they would be the god incarnate. People could actually approach them and pray to them and ask them questions, and the god would respond. And it was one of the few times that any normal Egyptian could have an interaction with a divinity.
How did it end up in this enormous stone box?
Well, after they died, they were mummified because they were the same kind of things, gods on earth. So they would have been eviscerated with all their internal organs removed. They would have then been dried with natron, and after that they would have been wrapped up with bandages. And then after that they'd be brought down through this corridor with great pomp and circumstance and celebrations and weeping and wailing at the same time, and then finally put inside these boxes, these sarcophagi, where they were supposed to rest for eternity.
The archaeological evidence seemed to suggest that because sacred animals like the Apis bull were the living forms of gods, the ancient Egyptians may have treated them with the same reverence as they did their pharaohs. Just like royalty, the sacred animals needed to be mummified to guarantee a successful afterlife. But at the other animal burial ground beneath Saqqara, archaeologists have recently made a count of all the animal mummies buried there, and there are literally millions of them. The Egypt detectives were sure that such a vast number of mummified animals could not all be as sacred as hawks and Apis bulls. The investigation was about to take a surprising turn and would reveal an unexpected link to the decline and fall of ancient Egypt itself. Archaeologist Miriam Cook and Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat are on a quest to find out why the Egyptians mummified animals in their millions. Scientific analysis has shown that some of these, like Apis bulls, were sacred and received the same mummification treatment after death as humans. But the Egypt detectives were sure that there was another reason behind the floor-to-ceiling piles of animal mummies at the Saqqara burial ground. The animal necropolis was first discovered in the 1920s. It is a maze of winding tunnels. But unlike the burial chamber of the Apis bull, devoted to a single sacred animal, the necropolis has many different sorts of mummified animals stacked up to the ceiling.
Of the thousands of burial places left by the ancient Egyptians, the catacombs here at Saqqara must be the strangest. For buried down here are more than 2.5 million animals, every one of them mummified. And this is just one of them.
There are many different species of animal buried down here, including ibis, hawks, and baboons. This zoo was very different from the Serapeum's cult of the single Apis bull. To see how these compared to the mummies of Apis bulls, the Egypt detectives asked mummification expert Dr. Stephen Buckley to carry out some tests on other animal mummies.
I wonder what Stephen managed to find out for us.
Well, I've got them online here. Hang on a second.
You're good at this.
The Egypt detectives were in for a big surprise.
Although it's very clear that some of these mummies were treated with a great deal of care and reverence and expensive materials, many others were fairly cheap and cheerful, and in fact some put together by using sticks and other bits of material.
This evidence suggested that many mummies were poorly produced. Stephen had even discovered fakes, animal mummies with nothing inside. This new evidence of mass production and fakes painted a very different picture from the carefully mummified sacred animals, like Apis bulls and hawks.
It does seem like it's a sudden craze.
Miriam and Dominic knew that the Apis bulls' burial chambers were built around 1400 BC. They contacted Stephen to find out if the sacred animals and fakes were made at different periods in time.
If we focus on the wrappings, these can be a useful way of determining which period in Egyptian history they came from. The more elaborate wrappings came in relatively late, 300 BC and onwards, during the Ptolemaic and particularly the Roman period, up to about 400 AD, where we really saw a big explosion in these numbers at this time.
Sounds like a bit of a sudden craze.
Yeah, rather than a long-term accumulation.
Stephen's work showed that there had been an explosion of animal mummification after 300 BC, a time when ancient Egypt was under foreign rule. The Egypt detectives headed to Alexandria, then Egypt's capital, to find out what was happening at the time.
So the key is those few hundred years, and we need to find out what was happening in Egypt at that time.
Well, at that time Egypt is changing beyond all recognition. We're here in Alexandria, the city built by Alexander the Great. He conquered Egypt and added it to his world empire. Then his successors ruled it for the best part of 3 centuries. And during that time, the culture changed.
Egypt had been conquered before and recovered, but the arrival of Alexander the Great changed this civilization forever. Alexander himself stayed for a very short time in Egypt, but he left behind a new ruling family, the Ptolemies, who took the place of the Egyptian pharaohs and ruled Egypt for more than 300 years. For the Egyptians, the new foreign rulers brought prosperity, and they had a fondness for Egyptian culture.
Could this have anything to do with the animal mummies?
Well, the animal mummies are all from temples, aren't they? So I think we need to find out exactly what's happening in the Egyptian temples under these foreign rulers.
To find out if there was a connection between foreign conquest and the new craze for animal mummification, the detectives went to one of Egypt's biggest temples, at Edfu. This immense temple, dedicated to Horus, the hawk god, was built by the new rulers of Egypt, who are shown as pharaohs on the massive temple walls. Before Alexander the Great and his heirs, Egyptian temples were accessible only to their priests and the Egyptian elite.
In earlier Egyptian times, temples would have been inaccessible to ordinary people like us. We'd have been stopped here at the great enclosure walls that ring the temple.
So elite spaces, really?
Oh yes, absolutely. And ordinary people would have polluted them just by going inside.
But Edfu was not exclusive to the elite. Its doors were also open to the middle classes. But how did this link to the animal mummification craze?
And the evidence lies in the architecture. Come and have a look at this. You'd never get a structure like this in an earlier Egyptian temple, right inside the enclosure walls. It's a complete innovation.
Go on.
Well, we know that people could hire the rooms inside structures like this for private celebrations like weddings and comings of age. So it's as though the great temples are being integrated into the private religious lives of individuals.
And what evidence do we have for this?
Oh, lots of documentation. In some cases, the actual wedding invitations.
So really big changes are happening. The boundaries are being broken down between the public and the private spaces, and people are being allowed in.
Yeah, that's right. What we need to do now, of course, is relate it back to the animal mummies.
Temples like the one at Edfu became popular places under Egypt's new rulers. This was a radical change. Common people were allowed inside certain temple walls. Under foreign rule, many Egyptian traditions had been lost, but one of the main surviving legacies of their great culture was their religion. The Egypt detectives thought it was likely that there was a link between this, the new temple culture, and animal mummification. Miriam and Dominic headed north again to piece together the evidence. Dominic knew that temples kept records, and that these might hold the solution to the mystery, and temple records from Saqqara have survived.
I'm looking at a drawer full of Egyptian temple records, and they're written on pieces of broken pot, which was actually a very common way of archive keeping at that time. And from what I'm seeing here, I'm getting an amazingly detailed picture of life in an Egyptian temple in all its facets: ritual, economic, social.
The temple records held the final piece of the puzzle. When people began visiting the new temples in the New Egypt, they brought gifts for the god. These were called votive offerings, and most of them took the form of sacred mummified animals. These were what made Egyptian religion so exceptional. Over time, as the changes to Egyptian society gathered pace under the new rulers, more and more of these offerings were brought, so more and more mummies had to be made. The temples became mummy factories, supplying votive animal mummies for the right price. Embalmers and potters would have been in high demand. There were even farms breeding animals just for mummification.
So what is going on?
It's a combination of religion, culture, and money.
Are you saying that the priests are making money out of the animal mummies?
Well, not exactly. Remember what's happening at this time. The Egyptians are coming more and more to the temples, and they want to show their piety and devotion to the gods by leaving a votive offering, an animal mummy. The priests sense a money-making opportunity, and so they start producing animal mummies to sell to the public.
Well, that would explain the mass production and the presence of those faiths that Stephen was talking about.
Exactly. Religion, culture, and money all come together. Result: 2.5 million animal mummies.
Egypt had been conquered, but it had hung on to a vital aspect of its culture by offering millions of animal mummies to the gods. But without any real power to sustain it, this extraordinary civilization began to fade. Then, it finally disappeared beneath the sands.